Hey, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to Stable B, our favorite place. So tonight, we're gonna be talking about something that you should not do to your motorcycle if you're planning on doing a lot of track riding or racing. Now, I'm gonna preface this with, it is something you can do. There are reasons to do it. There are some better ways to do it than not do it, but it's something I don't think you should actually do. It can affect the bike pretty heavily in a somewhat negative manner, especially if you don't know what you're doing and you do it the wrong way. So tonight, we're here to talk about lowering your motorcycle and why you shouldn't do it. Before we get into it, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel down below by clicking that great button. Throw a like on the video, and if you have any questions about lowering your bike or about getting to the racetrack or anything else that you might have questions about, please let me know down in the comments. Or if you've lowered a bike and you think I'm completely off, let me know down in the comments. Or if you're like, yeah, absolutely, this is good, and you got other great information that I missed in this video, please throw that in the comments also. As always, I love you guys' comments. I love hearing the feedback and building a good, not just video for me, but also comment section from all my track day junkies, club racers, and motorcycle engineers that might be watching and can also say some things of what I need to say. So we're gonna get into why you shouldn't actually lower your motorcycle, how people usually lower their motorcycles, what to do if you're a short rider, and how you can also still get a little bit of lowering effect out without getting the negatives of just straight up lowering your motorcycle. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Okay, so today, got our trusty Gixxer 750 here. This is a 2008 Suzuki GSXR 750. That's 749 cc's, 143 horsepower, actually, when it got dynoed. It's pretty sweet. But in front of me, right here, if you can see these, I have two lowering links. So here in a second, I'll show you where these were before I took them off. When I bought this bike, it was lowered in the rear, and it was lowered about an inch or two, which was awesome. Honestly, it was great. When I first started riding, I was able to almost flat foot this bike. I'm definitely smaller in stature, so it was a lot easier to come up to a stop and be very comfortable and hold the bike steady because I had both feet well on the ground, in some places almost flat footing, never quite there. But what that did for me was change the overall geometry of this bike. And once I started taking it to the racetrack, I'll say there were a couple other things on it that weren't like absolutely perfect. Was I able to ride on the racetrack? Absolutely. I was able to do track days, still have a lot of fun. But at the end of like my second year, actually it was the end of the first year, I ended up unlowering it. And I did see a difference in the handling of the bike. So we're gonna dig into that a little bit. Before we get there, I'll show you kind of what these are exactly, where they go. And then we'll talk about how lowering your bike can affect the handling, and we'll finish out with how you can still lower it without affecting the handling and the geometry of the bike. Okay, so on a bike, obviously, we have our front suspension right here. That comes up and connects to the frame. That's where your steering goes on your forks. So there's an angle there. And when you're thinking about it, you don't just think about the angle necessarily between those, but you take the bike on a flat plane at the axles, and then the angle from there to the top of that, and then also this angle, and all of that. There's a lot of angles that go into it. A lot of what I'm talking about tonight is actually referenced from this book over here, Motorcycle Dynamics, 2nd edition. A lot of great stuff in there if you want to nerd out. If you don't want to nerd out, just watch this video and you should kind of get the gist of it. But anyway, when you're looking at a motorcycle, you got to think about the different planes of view here, or planes of angles and whatever else. So you have the straight line from axle to axle. You have a straight line from axle to steering stem, and you have a straight line from steering stem to rear axle. So all of those play an important part, and when you start to lower the back or the front, those angles are gonna change a little bit. That'll throw off the geometry of the bike. So usually when you're lowering a motorcycle, people are talking about doing the rear. You're gonna have a piece much like this, or something similar. So you can see in there, that's where it lives, right there. There's a wishbone back here, and then that front part connects to the frame itself, and then the wishbone connects to the rear shock. And it all also connects to that swing arm. So this angle is what is gonna lower the bike. So if you throw this guy in here, you can see that's actually quite a bit longer, and that's not perfectly on there. Let's see, get that lined up. Yeah. So it's quite a bit longer, right? You're looking at about a ½ inch all the way back to like an inch, maybe almost an inch and a half of difference with these ones. So these came in a kit. Maybe, I didn't actually buy it. Like I said, I pulled them off the bike, but you put one on either side and you can lower the bike. And that's gonna bring the rear end of the bike down. By stretching that out, it'll come down a little bit. But like we mentioned, what we're gonna change then is the angle right here between here and up here. And we're also gonna end up changing that angle, pretty hard to change right there. but we will change, it changes a lot of stuff. And I'll get into why that's bad here in a second, but that is how you normally lower a bike, and that lowers just the rear. These have been sitting. Also, I did want to apologize real quick. I know we've been spending a lot of time in Stable B. It's getting to be the winter months, but we do have a trip coming up. Planning to go down to Texas, do some riding down there. We'll get some good content while we're down there, so be on the lookout for that. You should subscribe to the channel. Easiest way to find it. But, so Motorcycle Dynamics, it's a great book. It's an interesting read, and there's a lot of like just math in there. And it's kind of, when I first read it, I thought it was gonna be like all this cool stuff, and it was, but it's not like I'm gonna sit down and read a story type of book. It's I'm gonna sit down and think and maybe do some practice problems and then try and understand how this stuff actually affects the handling of a motorcycle. But a motorcycle is very different from a car because you only have 2 wheels, and so your turning comes from leaning that motorcycle, and so there's a lot of things that go into effect with that. There's tire profile, there's the width of the tires, there's the height of the sidewall of the tires. The profile, what I'm talking about, you would think maybe I was talking about width and the height of the sidewall, right? That aspect ratio. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the actual like shape of the tire. You get some that are way more round. You get some that are almost like pointed because they're a really long oval. All of that affects how the motorcycle handles. To go along with the tires, you have all these different angles on this bike. So when they're engineering these motorcycles, they're looking at all these different angles and looking at how we're gonna get the best handling out. So when you come in and you put a lowering kit on your bike and you take the rear down 2 inches, like we talked about, you're affecting all those angles, and now your steering is not what they engineered it to be. And so you're losing some of the effect, and it can have a pretty negative effect on handling. Other negative effects you can get from lowering your bike is just you're losing ground clearance. On a sport bike, generally, you're not gonna see a huge issue with that, but depending on what type of bike you're riding, if you have a kind of more street-based, not super sport, or a naked bike and you lower it, those pegs are gonna be even close to the ground. You're probably gonna start dragging them. On a bike like this, super sport, you could still start dragging your pegs or your shift levers or other things like that if you lower the bike way too far. So that's kind of another negative besides the handling. Now, once again, I'm a very short person, especially like this bike over here, my Aprilia. This thing's wicked tall. And when I first got it, it was kind of scary, right? There's times where when you're riding, you're good. And that's what kind of the biggest point here is that when you're out on a racetrack, you're not really gonna be stopping. But once you get into racing, you gotta stop once at the launch, and you gotta at least have 1 foot on the ground. But generally, you're there, you're ready to go race. And so if you can kind of just tiptoe it, you're gonna be good to go. So it's better to learn how to ride short with a normal height bike than it is to lower the bike. But when I got this bike, I took it in and got the suspension adjusted, and I was talking to the guy, I was like, can I lower this at all? And I didn't want to put a lowering kit on it, but if you lower the rear, bring it down, and you lower the front, theoretically your angles should stay the same. Now there's still a little bit that gets changed with that geometry. You're still gonna lose some ground clearance, but the angles of the bike should stay pretty much the same if you can lower it the same amount. Now it's not an inch on the rear and an inch on the front. It's the right amount to maintain the correct angles. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. So there's a lot of engineering and math and just craziness that goes into this, but I talked to him, the same guy did the suspension on this bike. He actually had me raise the rear up 10 millimeters. That was 5 millimeters. On this one, I was able to take the rear down about 3, which really wasn't that much. It didn't help me out that much, but I brought the front down 10. So that kind of helped a little bit. So that is what I was gonna say about if you're gonna lower it and you have to, let's say you are even shorter than me, or maybe you're taller than me, but you just have shorter legs, or whatever about your body means like, no, I just cannot ride this bike unless someone's like holding it up for me. It is gonna be pretty hard to race it. Now there are other ways around that. A lot of clubs in America, and I'm probably all around the world, are willing to like do some different things to help you guys out. So I implore you to still go talk to your club and get it figured out. But if you absolutely have to have the bike lowered, go talk to a suspension expert and make sure you're measuring in the front and the rear. You're actually lowering it the right amount so you don't affect that geometry of the bike. So there's rake, there's trail, there's your, let's see. Yeah, rake is gonna be that angle of like, here's straight up and down, 90 degree, and then how far out your front fork sticks. So once again, if you're like this and then you bring the back down, you're gonna end up having more rake, which is gonna make it harder to steer. It's gonna be kind of like laggy. Your trail is how far from a straight up and down line of your axle to ground, and how far back essentially your fork sits. So you never, like if you look at a bike and you realize that it is actually pretty angled, and those angles are very important. I'm gonna pull up this book real quick. so I don't misquote any of these words, because there's so many words. Caster angle, ideal trail, normal trail, the rake, the different planes, and then the final one would be the wheelbase. So that wheelbase is also going to be affected if you bring that rear down. Your rear wheel is kind of going to push it up, rear wheel out. It's going to stretch out a little bit, and that's also going to affect that handling of the bike. So anyway, I understand this is a little kind of all over the place, and I apologize for that, but the important part here that I want you to get across is that when you come out and like look at your bike, you're gonna come out and look at it, and you're gonna say, okay, here's my bike, Easton, I'm looking at it, and you're gonna say, okay, I see axle, steering stem. That's the easiest place to start all your different triangles. The subframe doesn't matter as much. It doesn't go into the handling of the bike. It does because of where you sit, but you can move that subframe all the way up, you could delete it, you could whatever. The swing arm, the frame, and the fork are the pivot points, and that's what changes the geometry of the bike. So as your wheelbase changes, that's going to affect your handling. As those angles change, that's going to affect your handling. As your ground clearance changes, that's going to affect your handling, and all of it's going to be not necessarily negative. There are some ways that you can adjust it to actually get like, well, maybe, hey, I want this bike to turn in better. Then you can adjust things like that and make it a little bit better. Maybe I want it to not turn in so much, and you can do that also, but messing with the geometry is probably like absolute last resort in my head. If you're a pro racer, you got a whole team behind you and you're building a super bike from scratch, then absolutely, get after it, go for it. You guys build the bike, but you probably got engineers that are looking at all these things and making sure those angles are still gonna work. For the rest of us that don't have that, we're gonna rely on the engineers that design the bike, and we're gonna adjust things that we can, like our suspension settings to make them stiffer or not. Our steering damper, if you have a hard time steering the bike into corners, you can loosen up that steering damper just a little bit. Be careful with that one. If you go too loose, then the bike will be super wobbly. And then if we want to adjust the height of the bike, we're gonna go talk to a suspension expert, or we're just gonna get a smaller seat, right? So there are seats that will have amount of stuff shaven off of them, or there's other things you could do if you wanna look into it. I don't have any ideas for you tonight, but you could modify how the seat mounts. Just get the seat to come down a little bit, and you'll have a lower seat height so your legs can reach without affecting the geometry of the bike. So the big picture tonight is that if you lower your motorcycle, especially just the rear, and you don't look at the math and do the math and figure out how much you need to lower the front to keep all the angles the same, you're gonna have a negative impact on the handling of the motorcycle. So once again, if you're super short, or your legs are super short, or you just can't reach the ground, or you're just not comfortable, you're a new rider, absolutely go lower it, go for it. It's not gonna be like drastic, like I'm not talking this is gonna make you crash. I'm just talking about you're gonna find that that bike doesn't handle how it's meant to from factory, and so it's not gonna perform at the peak performance. So once you start doing track days and then eventually you start racing, you could find yourself at a disadvantage to someone else that has a stock setup on their bike. So figuring out how to ride the bike with stock suspension is a much better option than figuring out how to lower the bike and then ride the bike with messed up motorcycle geometry. So to end this out, to close it all up, I am telling you 100%, this is just my opinion, do not lower your sport bike if you're gonna go start doing track days and racing. If it is lowered and you can't unlower it yet because of whatever, then absolutely just go do the track day. That's what we're all about here on this channel, is doing track days, having fun out on the racetrack in a safe environment. But if you can at all, take that thing back to stock height. Take it from me, I've done both. I rode this lowered for a while. Once I took it back to stock height, it was a big difference, and it handled it just so much better. It was still handled okay before, but I definitely did see a difference. And also that was me as like I was still a pretty new rider when I made that change. And I felt a noticeable difference in the bike's handling, and it felt happier, especially like going into corners and then coming out of the corner. It just felt a lot better. I don't know how to put that. It turned in easier, but not just easier, it was all more smooth. It was more fluid. I wasn't pushing the bike to do things I didn't want it to do or I wanted it to do. I was working with the bike to get the bike to do what we both needed to do to stay safe and ride correctly out there. So hopefully that makes sense. I mean, you guys learned a little bit about motorcycle dynamics. I do recommend maybe reading a book like that if you're a super freaking nerd and you got the time and the effort to put into reading that. Great read, kind of crazy. And once again, it's not something you just like read a story and you remember it for life. It's something that you would go back and reference anytime. And if you're at home, lowering the stuff on your own, you could absolutely use a book like that and look at the different angles, measure all the angles, and then make sure that however much you lower the bike is correct on both ends and get that bike down to a lower height. Hopefully that all made sense. The key takeaway here is go to a track day. The second key takeaway is keep your suspension height the same or get it adjusted with a suspension professional's help or by doing the math yourself. That will keep the bike a lot happier out on the track. That'll make it easier for you to ride fast. You ride fast at track days, you start club racing, you get so fast there that you go to Moto America, then you end up becoming a MotoGP star. That is the ladder of success on this YouTube channel. So keep it up, keep up the track days. If you have any questions, once again, please throw them down in the comments. While you're down there in the comment, ask me like, yo, what the hell is all this angle stuff about? Click on the subscribe button so you can stick around for the next videos that'll be coming out, and throw a like on the video. Unless you don't like it, then that's okay. Also throw a dislike if you made it this far in the video. I'm down for it. If you have any other questions, you're like, hey, I'm not sure about putting these in the YouTube comments, hit me up on Instagram at JKMoto Podcast. I'll answer anything and everything. And that should cover us. So that's gonna be it. Thank you guys for watching. Go not lower your motorcycle, do a track day. We'll see you in the next video.